me Violet, 26 years old. I work as a writer for a progressive online news site. My whole life is basically dedicated to fighting for what's right, calling out injustice wherever I see it. I have a pretty good life, I think. Got a boyfriend who gets it, or at least he nods in all the right places. Have a solid group of girlfriends who are just as passionate as I am. We meet up for brunch or drinks and talk for hours about the state of the world, the patriarchy, all of it. It feels like we're part of something important. My work feels important too. I write articles that get people talking, articles that challenge the status quo. I genuinely believe I'm on the right side of history. A few months back, during one of our editorial meetings over a video call, we were brainstorming new long-form projects. Everyone was pitching ideas about corporate greed, environmental issues, the usual stuff. Important. But I felt we needed something with more of a human element, something that felt immediate and dangerous. So I spoke up. I told my editor I wanted to do a deep dive into the manosphere. Specifically, I wanted to investigate a group I'd heard whispers about. Men going their own way, or MGTOW. I painted a picture for my team, described them as a shadowy network of rejected men, festering in their own bitterness online, explained how they blame women for all their problems and create an echo chamber of pure toxicity. I said it was a breeding ground for real-world resentment, and I wanted to expose it. My editor's eyes lit up. He loved it. He called it brave, cutting-edge journalism. My colleagues were all supportive, telling me it was a crucial story that needed to be told. I felt a rush of validation. This was my chance to write something that could actually open people's eyes to a hidden threat. I spent the next week doing preliminary research, which mostly involved scrolling through angry forum posts and watching angry video rants. Everything I saw just confirmed my initial hypothesis. These guys were a bunch of losers who couldn't handle rejection, so they built an entire philosophy around hating women. It was all so simple, so black and white. My article would practically write itself. The plan was to find a local group, if such a thing even existed in the physical world, and convince them to let me observe them. I wanted to be a fly on the wall, documenting their sad little world. My friends thought I was incredibly brave. "Aren't you scared?" one of them asked over dinner. I told her that fear is the price of progress. My boyfriend was a bit more hesitant. He just said to be careful, that some of those guys could be unstable. I dismissed his concern as him just being protective, which was a little problematic, but I let it slide. He was trying, at least. Finding them was easier than I expected. A bit of digging on some obscure forums led me to a post mentioning a loose gathering in my city. There was an email address for a guy who apparently organized their meetups. His name was Frank. I spent a whole evening drafting the perfect email. It had to be carefully worded. I presented myself as an independent journalist doing a cultural study on modern men's groups. I used neutral academic language, trying my best to sound like an unbiased observer. I hit send and braced myself for the response. I expected one of two things, either complete radio silence or a long, aggressive email full of paranoid accusations. What I got was neither. The next morning, a reply was sitting in my inbox. It was from Frank. The email was short, maybe 4 sentences long. It was polite, grammatically correct, and completely straightforward. He wrote that they weren't a formal group, just a few guys who shared some interests. He said they usually got together on weekends to work on their personal projects. He ended it with, "You're welcome to come by this Saturday if you'd like. We'll be at my workshop. I'll send you the address if you're interested." That was it. No questions about my agenda, no paranoia, no anger. It was so disarming that it actually made me more suspicious. This had to be a trap. They were trying to lull me into a false sense of security. They were smarter than I thought. I wrote back, saying I'd be there, and he sent the address to a light industrial area on the edge of town. Perfect. A secluded location where no one would hear me scream. I was only half joking when I thought that. I told my boyfriend about it that night. I was explaining my theory about how their politeness was a manipulative tactic. He was making dinner and not really listening, just humming and nodding. I noticed he had bought some expensive-looking steaks. I pointed out that the consumption of red meat is often linked to performative masculinity and has a huge environmental footprint. I didn't say it in an accusatory way, more of an educational one. He just stopped, looked at the steaks, then at me. He didn't say anything. He just quietly put them back in the fridge and took out some frozen veggie burgers instead. The rest of the evening was quiet. I felt a little guilty, but also a little proud. I was holding him accountable. That's what a good partner does. Saturday came. I made sure my phone was fully charged, my location sharing was on with my best friend, and I had a can of pepper spray in my purse. The address led me to a row of identical-looking garage units. It was a place for small businesses, mechanics, carpenters, that sort of thing. I found the unit with the right number. The big roll-up door was open. I parked my car and walked towards it, my heart beating a little faster. I peered inside. It wasn't some dark, dingy man cave. It was a bright, clean, and incredibly organized workshop. Tools were hung neatly on a pegboard wall. There was a large workbench in the center, and in the middle of the space was a partially disassembled vintage motorcycle on a lift. A man was leaning over it, carefully cleaning a part with a rag. He was older, maybe late 40s, with graying hair and a calm, focused expression. This had to be Frank. On a stool in the corner, another man, probably around 30, was hunched over a circuit board, a soldering iron in his hand. This was Ryan, and at a small desk against the far wall, a younger guy, early 20s, was sitting with a thick textbook and a laptop. Matthew. The place smelled of oil, metal, and sawdust. It was peaceful. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Frank looked up, saw me, and wiped his hands on a clean rag. He smiled. It wasn't a creepy smile, just a normal, friendly one. "You must be Violet," he said, walking over. "I'm Frank. Welcome." He introduced me to the other two. Ryan gave a quick, shy wave without looking up from his soldering. Matthew just nodded, a little awkwardly. Frank offered me a coffee, which I accepted. I pulled out my little notebook and a pen, ready to start documenting all the subtle signs of toxicity. I sat on a stool he cleared for me, and I just watched, and I listened. For the next 3 hours, I was a fly on the wall in the most boring secret lair I'd ever seen. They barely even talked to each other for the first hour. Each man was completely absorbed in his own task. The only sounds were the clinking of Frank's tools, the quiet hiss of Ryan's soldering iron, and the rustle of Matthew's textbook pages. There was no anger, no resentment, just a quiet, focused energy. Eventually, they started talking a little. Frank asked Ryan how his retro gaming console project was coming along. Ryan lit up, explaining some technical challenge he was having with the video output. Frank listened intently, asking smart questions even though he clearly didn't know much about electronics. Then Ryan asked Frank about the motorcycle. Frank explained it was a model from the 70s that he was restoring for a client. He spoke about it with a passion and precision that was almost artistic. They talked about Matthew's upcoming exams. He was studying mechanical engineering. Frank and Ryan both offered him advice, not on his life, but on a specific fluid dynamics problem he was stuck on. Not once did they mention women. Not once did they complain about dating or society or anything I was expecting. Their conversation was entirely about building things, fixing things, and learning things. I tried to steer the conversation. I asked Frank, "So, is this what you guys usually do? Just hang out and work on hobbies?" He looked at me, seeming a little confused by the question. "Pretty much," he said. "It's relaxing, cheaper than therapy, and at the end of it, you've got a working motorcycle." He chuckled. I tried to probe deeper. "So, what's the philosophy behind going your own way?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Ryan spoke up for the first time, his eyes still fixed on his circuit board. He said it wasn't really a philosophy. It was more of an observation. He explained that he'd spent years and a lot of money on dating apps and bars, trying to find a connection, and it just left him feeling stressed and broke. He decided his time, money, and energy were better spent on things that gave him a sense of accomplishment and joy, like building his own video game console. Matthew chimed in, saying it was the same for him. He said that navigating the modern dating scene felt like a full-time job with a high chance of failure, and he'd rather focus on getting his degree and starting his career. It was all so reasonable. Their explanations were devoid of the hatred I'd read online. They weren't angry. They sounded relieved. I kept waiting for the mask to slip. I thought, maybe when they get more comfortable with me, they'll start revealing their true colors. But it never happened. I left that afternoon feeling completely bewildered. My head was spinning. There was nothing to report. I had pages of notes about carburetors and pixel resolutions, but nothing on toxic masculinity. My grand expose was turning into a boring feature story about a men's hobby club. I got home, and my boyfriend was on the couch watching TV. I immediately launched into a rant about my confusing day. "They're putting on an act, I'm sure of it," I told him. "It's all performative. They're trying to project this image of being peaceful and productive, but it's a front for their deep-seated resentment." I went on, psychoanalyzing every little thing I'd seen. Frank's focus on restoring old machines, a pathetic attempt to reclaim a bygone era of male dominance, Ryan's video game project, a retreat into a digital fantasy world where he has control, Matthew's dedication to his studies, a clear sign of emotional immaturity and an inability to form human connections. I had it all figured out. I just needed proof. My boyfriend was quiet the whole time I was talking. He just sat there, staring at the blank TV screen. When I finally ran out of steam, he turned to me. His face looked tired, older than I'd ever seen it. "Violet," he said, his voice flat, "do you ever just stop?" I didn't understand. "Stop what? Stop fighting for what's right?" "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Stop analyzing everything. Stop turning everything into a battle. Stop looking for the worst in people." I was stunned. "I'm not looking for the worst. I'm looking for the truth." "Are you?" he asked. "Or are you just looking for confirmation of what you already believe?" I felt a surge of anger. He was gaslighting me, using my own passion against me. "How can you say that?" I said, my voice rising. "After everything we've talked about, I thought you were on my side." "This isn't about sides," he said, standing up. "This is about my life, our life, and I can't live like this anymore. I feel like I'm constantly being graded. Like every word I say, every choice I make, is being judged against some ideological checklist. I bought steaks because I like steaks, not because I'm trying to perform masculinity." He walked into the bedroom. I heard him opening drawers. I followed him, my mind racing. "What are you doing?" I asked, even though I already knew. "I'm leaving, Violet," he said, not looking at me. He was pulling clothes out of the closet and stuffing them into a gym bag. "You're leaving? Just like that? Because of a conversation about steaks?" "It's not about the steaks," he said, finally turning to face me. "It's never been about the steaks. It's about the fact that it's always something. I'm tired of walking on eggshells in my own home. I'm tired of feeling like I'm a disappointment just for being me." He zipped up his bag and walked past me, heading for the door. I was speechless. I couldn't believe this was happening. "So, you're just giving up?" I called after him. "You're just going to run away because things got a little challenging?" He stopped at the door and looked back at me. There was no anger in his eyes, just a deep, profound sadness. "No, Violet," he said quietly. "I'm not running away. I'm going my own way." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silent apartment. His last words echoed in my head. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. The sound of the door clicking shut was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I just stood there in the middle of the living room for what felt like an hour. The veggie burger patties were still on the counter, slowly thawing. My first thought wasn't sadness. It was pure, righteous anger. How dare he? How dare he twist my words and turn my passion for justice into a personal failing? He couldn't handle being with a strong, principled woman, so he ran. It was the classic playbook, male fragility in its purest form. He didn't leave because of me. He left because he was weak. This whole narrative cemented itself in my mind, a solid and comforting shield against the hurt. I grabbed my phone and immediately called my friends. I put them on a group call and told them everything, framing it exactly as I saw it. My politically unaware boyfriend had finally buckled under the pressure of being in an enlightened relationship. They reacted perfectly. There were gasps of outrage. They called him a coward. They said he was gaslighting me. They said I was better off without him and his latent toxicity. One of them said his going my own way comment was a passive-aggressive jab of the highest order. It was exactly what I needed to hear. They validated every ounce of my anger. We spent an hour dissecting his every flaw, and by the end of the call, I felt powerful again. I wasn't a victim. I was a survivor of a problematic relationship. That feeling carried me through the next couple of days. I threw myself into my work, determined to make this MGTOW article the best thing I'd ever written. The breakup just added fuel to the fire. Now it wasn't just a story. It was personal. These men and their ideology had, indirectly, ruined my relationship. I was going to expose them for the poison they were. My editor was getting impatient. He sent me an email asking for a preliminary draft. I told him I was still in the observation phase, trying to gain their trust before they revealed their true nature. It was a lie, but it bought me some time. I knew I had to go back to the workshop. I needed more material. I needed the smoking gun. The following weekend, I drove back to the industrial park. This time, I didn't feel any fear. I just felt a cold, determined anger. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was an interrogator. I found them in the same workshop, but the atmosphere was different. The motorcycle was pushed to the side. They were all gathered around the workbench, where Matthew was standing awkwardly in a button-down shirt that looked a little too big for him. Frank and Ryan were sitting on stools, acting like a panel of judges. It looked like they were coaching him. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Frank explained that Matthew had a big job interview on Monday for an internship at an engineering firm. They were running him through mock interview questions. My journalistic senses started tingling. This was interesting. This was a chance to see their ideology in action. I sat down to watch. Frank was asking the questions. They were tough, technical questions about things I didn't understand. But they were also asking behavioral questions. "Tell me about a time you had a conflict with a team member. Describe a project you're proud of." Matthew was nervous, stammering through his answers. Ryan would gently interrupt him, giving him advice on how to structure his responses. He told him to be more confident, to make eye contact, to speak clearly about his accomplishments without sounding arrogant. It was all surprisingly normal and helpful. I decided to throw a wrench in the works. "What are you going to do if your interviewer is a woman?" I asked, looking directly at Matthew. The three of them looked at me. There was a moment of silence. I expected them to launch into a tirade about female bosses. Instead, Ryan just looked at me with a genuinely puzzled expression. He said, "He'll answer her questions professionally, just like he would with a man." I pushed a little harder. "But you guys obviously have issues with women in positions of power. Aren't you worried it will show?" Frank sighed, a patient, tired sound. He looked at me and said that this had nothing to do with any of that. He explained that they were helping Matthew get a job so he could build a good life for himself. The gender of his future boss was completely irrelevant to the task at hand. He said, "We're not preparing him for a culture war, Violet. We're preparing him for a job interview." The directness of his answer shut me down. They went back to their mock interview, and I just sat there, feeling a little foolish. They spent another hour with Matthew, building his confidence, refining his answers. There was a genuine sense of camaraderie, of mentorship. They wanted him to succeed. After they were done, we were all just sitting around, and it was quiet for a bit. I decided to try a different angle. I looked at Frank. "Why did you start all this?" I asked. "The workshop, these meetups, what was the trigger?" I was expecting a story about a horrible woman who wronged him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the half-finished motorcycle. He told me it wasn't really a single trigger. It was a slow process. He said he used to be married, owned a successful construction business that he built from the ground up, had a nice house in the suburbs. Then he got divorced. He spoke about it in a way I'd never heard a man talk about divorce before. I was used to hearing either angry rants or stoic silence. Frank was neither. He spoke about it with a kind of detached clarity, like an engineer describing a catastrophic structural failure. He didn't badmouth his ex-wife. He barely even mentioned her. He talked about the process. He described the lawyers, the court dates, the financial affidavits. He explained how, in the end, he lost the house, lost a significant portion of his business, and was left with crippling alimony payments and a mountain of legal debt. He said the most soul-crushing part wasn't losing the money. It was the realization that the system was designed in a way that his hard work, his risk, his years of effort could be dismantled and given away so efficiently. He said he wasn't mad at his ex. He was just done with the system itself. He said he decided to stop participating in a game where the rules felt rigged against him. So he sold what was left of his business, downsized his life, and opened this small workshop where he could work with his hands and have something that was truly his own. He said he met Ryan and Matthew online, in forums where other men were talking about similar experiences. They weren't looking for a political movement. They were just looking for a quiet place to be. When he finished talking, the workshop was silent. Ryan and Matthew were just nodding slowly, as if they'd heard it all before. I didn't know what to say. My entire worldview was built on the idea that men held all the power, that the system was built for them. To hear him describe that same system as a trap, and to do it without any of the vitriolic anger I expected, was deeply unsettling. I mumbled something about needing to go and left quickly. The drive home was a blur. My head was full of contradictions. Nothing made sense. That weekend, I was supposed to meet my friends for our usual brunch. I almost canceled. I didn't know what I could possibly say to them, but I knew if I didn't go, they'd worry, and I didn't have the energy to deal with that. So I went. The moment I sat down, they started in on my ex again. They had all these new theories about his emotional immaturity and manipulative behavior. I just sat there, stirring my coffee, not really contributing. They noticed my silence. "Violet, are you okay?" one of them asked, putting her hand on my arm. "You seem distant." And then I made a huge mistake. I decided to be honest. I told them I was just confused. I tried to explain what I'd seen at the workshop. I told them about the mock interview, about how they were genuinely trying to help the younger guy succeed. Their faces started to harden. Then I told them what Frank had said about his divorce. I tried to convey the tone he'd used, the lack of bitterness, the focus on the systemic issues he felt he'd faced. I finished by saying, it was just not what I expected. They're not angry monsters. They're just quiet. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. My three best friends stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. Finally, one of them spoke. Her voice was sharp. "Are you seriously defending them, Violet?" I stammered. "No, of course not. I'm just telling you what I observed. It's more complicated than I thought." "Complicated?" Another one scoffed. "There's nothing complicated about a group of misogynists. They're manipulating you. Can't you see that?" The third one, the one I'd always been closest to, looked at me with an expression of deep disappointment. "I can't believe I'm hearing this from you," she said. "You're starting to sound like them. Have you ever heard of internalized misogyny? You're feeling sympathy for your own oppressors." I tried to argue. I told them they weren't there. They didn't see it. But it was like talking to a brick wall. They had already made up their minds. The conversation devolved from there. They accused me of being a bad journalist, of being emotionally compromised since my breakup. They said I was betraying everything we believed in. I felt the room getting smaller, the air getting thinner. These were my people, my support system, and they were turning on me with a ferocity I'd never seen before. I ended up just standing up, throwing some money on the table, and walking out without another word. My hands were shaking. I got in my car and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to breathe. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from our group chat. I opened it. The chat was still there, but my name was gone. They had removed me. I tried to call my closest friend. It went straight to voicemail. I tried another one. Same thing. Just like that, in the space of a single brunch, I had been excommunicated. First my boyfriend, now my friends. My entire social world had evaporated. And the most terrifying, ironic part was that I had been cast out for the crime of expressing a nuanced thought. My sisterhood, which was supposed to be my safe space, had turned out to be more rigid and unforgiving than the group of men I was supposed to be exposing. I drove home to my empty apartment, feeling a kind of loneliness I had never imagined was possible. I was completely and utterly alone. The days that followed were a gray, formless blur. My apartment, which used to be my sanctuary, now felt like a prison cell. The silence was deafening. I'd walk from the bedroom to the kitchen and back again, picking things up and putting them down without purpose. I stopped answering my phone. The only person who called was my editor, and I didn't have the energy to lie to him anymore. I spent hours scrolling through social media, watching the digital lives of my former friends unfold without me. There were pictures of them at brunch, at rallies, at gallery openings. They were smiling, holding up signs, and living the life I used to be a part of. It felt like watching a movie of my own life with my character edited out. In one photo, they were all wearing t-shirts with a slogan I had come up with. It was a surreal, gut-wrenching feeling. My sense of identity was completely shattered. I was Violet, the feminist journalist, the social justice warrior. But without my boyfriend to validate me, my friends to agree with me, and my article to prove my worth, who was I? I was just a person in an empty room. The anger I had felt after the breakup was gone. The confusion I'd felt after visiting the workshop was gone. All that was left was a hollow, aching emptiness. My ideology, the very framework I had used to understand the world, had collapsed. It had promised me community, but it had left me isolated. It had promised me clarity, but it had left me confused. It had promised me strength, but I had never felt weaker. I thought about Frank, Ryan, and Matthew. My mission to expose them seemed like a joke from a different lifetime. I had entered their world with so much certainty, so much condescending pity. I was going to show them how sad and empty their lives were, devoid of female companionship. But their lives weren't empty. They were full. They were full of projects, purpose, and quiet camaraderie. My life was the one that was empty. I was the one who was lonely. I was the one who had been abandoned by my community for failing a purity test. The irony was suffocating. About a week after the brunch incident, I got an email from my editor. It was short and to the point. He said my deadline had passed, I wasn't responding to his calls, and the MGTOW article was officially killed. He also said that due to my unprofessionalism, my contract with the site was being terminated. I was fired. I read the email 3 times, but I felt nothing. It was like watching a building collapse in a city that had already been leveled. It just didn't matter anymore. I closed my laptop and just stared out the window for a long time. I realized I hadn't been outside in days. On a strange impulse, I grabbed my car keys. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just started driving. My car seemed to know where to go. I found myself back in the light industrial park, parked across the street from Frank's workshop. It was a Saturday afternoon. The big roll-up door was open. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there, watching. It was like looking into a diorama of a life I didn't understand. The scene was almost identical to my first visit, but I was seeing it with new eyes. Frank was working on the motorcycle. It was nearly finished now. The chrome parts gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He was meticulously polishing the gas tank with a soft cloth. His movements were slow, deliberate, and full of care. Matthew was there, but he wasn't studying. He was standing next to an old beat-up car, and Frank was leaning over the open hood with him, pointing at something inside the engine. Matthew was listening intently, nodding. It looked like Frank was teaching him how to do a simple repair. And in the corner, Ryan was sitting on his stool, not soldering, but playing something. On the small table in front of him was a clunky homemade-looking console hooked up to a small monitor. He was holding a retro-style controller, his thumbs moving quickly. On the screen, a little pixelated character was jumping across platforms. He had finished his project. After a few minutes, he put the controller down and looked over at Frank and Matthew. He said something I couldn't hear. Frank and Matthew laughed and walked over. Ryan handed the controller to Matthew. Matthew, the serious engineering student, started to play the game. He was clumsy at first, but then he got the hang of it. A huge, goofy grin spread across his face. Frank stood behind them, watching, with a small, content smile on his face. They weren't fighting the system. They weren't drafting manifestos. They weren't complaining about women. They were just being. They were building things. They were learning things. They were sharing things. They had created their own small, quiet world. A world that operated on a simple set of principles: competence, mutual respect, and a shared desire for peace. A world that didn't require constant conflict to exist. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they were perfectly happy. They weren't coping. They were thriving. They hadn't lost anything. They had walked away from a game they didn't want to play, and in doing so, they had won. They had won their time, their energy, their money, and their peace of mind. I was the one who had lost. I had played the game with all my heart. I had followed all the rules. I had fought all the prescribed battles, championed all the right causes, and surrounded myself with all the right people. And in the end, I had lost everything. I lost my relationship because my ideology was more important than my partner's happiness. I lost my friends because my observations didn't conform to their narrative. I lost my job because my truth turned out to be a fiction. I sat there in my car, watching these 3 men share a moment of simple, uncomplicated joy. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or confusion. I just felt a profound sense of clarity. I had thought I was the one with the enlightened worldview, looking down on these poor, misguided men from my moral high ground. The whole time, I had it completely backwards. I was the one living in a dark, narrow echo chamber. I was the one trapped in a rigid, unforgiving ideology. They weren't the ones in the cage. I was. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look back. I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do with my life. Everything was a blank slate, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt less like a terrifying void and more like a possibility. It felt like freedom.